Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. My name is Nuno Fernandes, Professor of Finance at the EIB Business School, also Chairman of the Board of the Portuguese Central Bank. And with me, I have Abdulaziz Al Khalifa, who is the CEO of Qatar Development Bank, and Emma Navarro, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Our objective today is to discuss briefly the links between finance and innovation, and in particular, we are here to try to understand how to successfully fund growth companies and innovation, and the role that different players and markets play in it. Now, in my recent book on M&As, I show how the majority of mergers and acquisitions tend to fail. And the majority of companies tries to innovate by acquiring other companies, and that does not deliver strong results. So on average, companies overpay and they don't get the results they want by acquiring other companies, either because the talent leaves or because the synergies are not actually there. So the problem is that this kind of growth is very fashionable, it's called strategic, but often doesn't deliver value. And I want to see now how our two members of the panel also see this from the banking world. How are you seeing this growth of companies when it relates to funding? Let me start with Emma. Emma, where do you see the biggest challenges when looking to invest in innovation from the European Investment Bank perspective? Where are we lacking, and what are the biggest areas that need improvement?
I think that basically Europe is confronted to three challenges. First is the need to invest more in R&D. In terms of GDP, we are lagging behind in these investments compared to the US or China or Japan or South Korea. The second challenge is a faster adoption of digital technologies. Here again, we are lagging behind the US, and we know how important these technologies are for the European economy and for the future. And the third is to have a greater number of startups and scale-ups. For example, again, if we compare to the US, the number of these type of companies is 4 times higher in the US than in Europe. And the reason why are some structural impediments, such as fragmented markets in Europe. We are still having and being confronted to fragmented markets, or a less developed capital, venture capital market, or a home bias by entrepreneurs.
Very good. Abdulaziz, the same question to you. From your perspective and experience, where do you see the biggest challenges when looking at to invest and fund innovation?
Sure, thank you. So I think that challenges to small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs, they could be universal. But in the Middle East, more specifically, there are 4 main challenges that are facing those entrepreneurs and SMEs. So access to information and adequate training is part of that. The other element would be access to funding. And access to funding due to the lack of private sector contribution in enabling the entrepreneurs and small and medium enterprises and making sure that they have adequate funding for the growth of their enterprises is becoming an not enabling factor for those small and medium enterprises. The third challenge that we face actually for the small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs is access to markets. We've seen through the support that we provide to entrepreneurs that the markets are not very well established in order for those entrepreneurs to be able to capture the opportunities locally. The fourth challenge that they normally face is the legal structure itself within the Middle East. It's not a very friendly market to exist, and sometimes exits in terms of investment is not available for the investors and for the entrepreneurs to be able to exit once they establish those ventures back there.
Very good. So I'll pick actually upon that, because one of the innovation is at the lifeblood of any successful company, and the growth of a company often requires capital markets to work well. But often companies fail to adapt to a lack of funding. we've been living extraordinary periods since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. IPOs, initial public offerings, are at a record low. So capital markets, stock exchange is at a record low, but we know there is plenty of money out there, in particular after quantitative easing programs. And so private markets have been working very liquid, and we have companies that are basically owned by private funds, and they tend to be flipped from one fund to the other, and often the valuations are very, very high after this move from one fund to the other. But I think we are seeing now a change. And in 2019, public markets are actually getting more important because, for instance, we see Uber and the IPO of Uber 6 months ago, big tech company. They severely underperform, right? And the IPO of Uber, stock price down 50% in 6 months. So since the Web Summit started on Monday, Uber lost $7 billion of market cap. So I don't think this is because of the Web Summit, because all of you have been using Uber. But still, I think business model, cash flows, and profitability are becoming increasingly important. And so this is changing because just this month or last month, WeWork, one of these big companies doing the co-working, tried to go public, and they supposedly had a valuation of $50 billion US. When they try to go public, the market simply does not trust companies with no cash flows and losing money every day. So, and many pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, private investors lost significant amount of money by investing in less transparent firms. So I think there is a paradigm shift in markets that they are not trusting unicorns or companies with inflated valuation, but without a business model behind or financial sustainability. So maybe we are close to the end of the days of endless and infinite funding without any cash flows or profitability. So I would like now to turn to you from the banking world and from your region and experience. What trends, let's start with Abdulaziz, what are the trends that you see in the region of funding, in particular private market funding and the private sector? How is the funding going in the region in Qatar?
Well, funding is still a big issue when it comes to small and medium enterprises, and more specifically funding innovation back in the Middle East. We see a trend where more and more private equity funds, venture capitals start to exist in the region. But it's still not enough. Normally, companies in the Middle East would actually head to Europe or to the States to gain more access to the funding. I think just last year there was some statistics that were issued that there is a 3% increase in terms of VC existence in the Middle East. But I see also more corporate funds getting established back home, which provide more accessibility to funding. We see that this challenge is normally solved through the governments. We've seen that the governments in the Middle East back there are providing some sort of fund of funds to enable those funds to exist currently. And I'll give you a little bit of an example from my country, from Qatar, where we have a fund of funds of almost $1 billion US, and we help funds to come and coexist in the country to enable accessibility to funds for innovation. The government also invested a lot in research and development, but we have been facing a lot of issues to commercialize that innovation. And due to the lack of existence of those private funds, that problem hasn't yet been solved. And we know collectively that private money would be smarter in a way to commercialize on this research and development.
Thank you. And Emma, what's your opinion on the role of capital markets in particular and the private versus public funding? How are you seeing this? What trends do you see here?
Well, I think, that, of course, capital markets play a fundamental role today for innovation and to fill the funding gaps that we still have. But sometimes what I feel, and in Europe as in other regions, that the public sector can be a complementary role, can play a complementary role to the private sector. For example, the public sector with funds or with other instruments can help mobilize private investors towards innovative projects. Or a clear example is what we do at the European Investment Bank with the venture debt market, a market that is very important for innovation and where Europe lags behind compared to the US. Our market today is around, in Europe, 300, 500 million of venture capital, and this is a very important instrument because it helps innovative companies that want to grow and scale up to have a different source of funding that has the advantages of long-term loans, but with the remuneration based on performance. And this is also an important instrument when you want to grow to avoid diluting your capital participation. And here, the European Investment Bank is trying to develop this market in Europe. We are investing around 600 million every year in this segment of the market in order to fill this gap that Europe has.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to know, listen to some of the success stories that both of your institutions have experienced, and maybe start with Abdulaziz. Do you have any successful investment stories that drove growth in the region through innovation you would like to share?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of success stories, but I'll share one of them, which is as you know, Qatar is hosting the World Cup 2022. And we normally look at challenges and how can entrepreneurs and SMEs play a role in supporting us in delivering on such a big event. And in Qatar, we've established something called Qatar Sport Technology Accelerator. And in that acceleration program, we are investing in a lot of those companies that would be able to enhance the fan experience, the tracking of the athletes, and ensuring proper engagement, performance measurements, and seeing how those entrepreneurs have been able to come up with technologies. And we're supporting them through investment, incubation, acceleration. And inshallah, in 2022, once you guys also will hopefully will be there in Doha to witness the World Cup, a lot of that technology is going to be used in the World Cup 2022. And for us, that would be a great success story, actually.
Thank you for the invitation. We all heard the invitation to be in Doha for the World Cup in 2022. Sure. Thank you, Abdulaziz. Emma, on the same side, can you share any successful investment stories that drove growth and innovation in Europe and the investment bank?
I think, for example, with the European Investment Fund, our subsidiary with venture debt, we have been supporting innovation for many years. In the last 15 years, we have supported around half of the European unicorns that exist today. Companies such as Skype, Zalando, Spotify, BlaBlaCar, and many others. So this is an example. But we also support other projects that maybe are not unicorns, but are very important for innovation in Europe. For example, last year we supported here in Portugal with our bank WindFloat, which is a new technology that develops offshore wind plants. And this is a cutting-edge technology with the potential to change the wind energy sector. Or yesterday, I signed an agreement with a Spanish startup, QEV, and who is developing electric driving technologies that will foster clean transportation.
Thank you, Emma. Final question, Abdulaziz. What do you think the future looks like for SMEs, and which sectors are growing, and where are the opportunities in the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East. Okay. So we're talking about a population of almost 450 million with, I think last statistics, 96% smartphone ownership, and 88%, if I'm not mistaken, daily are online. Very young population. That drives innovation within technology, within social technology and within technology. Taking into consideration that still there are challenges. The whole Middle East is changing from political aspects, social aspects, and that create opportunities normally for small and medium enterprises, taking into consideration how technological savvy the young generation is.
Very good, thank you. And Emma, the final question also for you is related to the Sustainable Development Goals and the role that the European Investment Bank plays in it, and how do you see this going forward?
Well, as a public bank, our activity is very much related with the Sustainable Development Goals. If you think on the most important Sustainable Development Goals, end poverty, promote sustainable growth, innovation, climate change, life below water, those are things that we try to promote, and we try to promote this type of investments. And climate change is clearly one of our priorities right now. We want to position ourselves as the EU Climate Bank. We want to unlock 1 trillion of investments in climate and environmental sustainable activities in the next decade. And I would say that this is one of the priorities right now.
Very good. So thank you very much, both of our speakers, and thank you very much for everybody being here. And thank you.